and this is the Incongruous channel, and I'm Dr. Andy Yates. And the show I did on Saturday on Beetroot Radio, on www.beetrootradio.co.uk, was about the mind. It focused on anxiety and obviously stress and stuff like that. Also talked about some aspects of the mind. Check it out if you need to. But of course, having talked about anxiety, then I also talked about ways perhaps that anxiety could be dealt with. And one of those is using drugs. But I talked about both synthetic, natural, prescribed and non-prescribed. So again, check it out as a podcast on my channel, on my website, which is www.drandyates.com. But this YouTube video, I'm going to talk about cannabis. So I have to say, if you like this, please like, share and subscribe on YouTube. Thank you. And the reason I'm going to talk about cannabis is because it seems to have gone awfully quiet, the idea of perhaps legalizing cannabis. And what perhaps we need to understand is that there's a great history of delegalization of cannabis, which has occurred for various reasons in the United States. The main reason for delegalizing cannabis was the threat of using hemp, which is a variety of cannabis, to make paper. And basically Hearst, that is the newspaper magnate in the United States, demonized cannabis. And, the head of what was the predecessor of the DEA then said some terrible things about cannabis, very racial things, to demonize it so that hemp would be included as part of a drug ban on those sort of things, so that the paper industries, which would be the forestry industries and stuff like that, would be able to make lots of money. And I thought about that, and I thought, well, I wonder if that's the same case in the UK, because in the UK, since about 1928, I think there were some rules on cannabis, but they didn't really come into force until around, there's a clock going there, sorry, this is the Incongruous channel, this is what you get. There wasn't really any hard, what should we say, serious rules until the 60s and 70s, because that's when it became popular, cannabis. There was the hippie culture, and anybody who was anti-cannabis was going to talk about that being a problem. But there was a lot of racism as well, because it was basically that immigrants were coming to the country who were what they called Negroes, black people, right? And also the Chinese, and it's kind of ironic, really, seeing as Britain sold China opium for, 100 years or something like this to keep them under control and try and make every Chinese an addict. And then, of course, they come over here and it's like, oh, these are drug-crazed people, but whatever. Let's move on for that. And I am going to look at my notes during this because I want to get it right, because I'm going to mention some things that might get me in hot water unless I make sure I get it right. So let's do that. One of the things that were good that has been researched into treating anxiety is cannabis. And it's been found by various researchers that it's actually a great deal of help, particularly one of its ingredients in the cannabis plant, which is cannabidiol, CBD. And cannabidiol can be, and mostly is, very low in this substance called THC, which I think is something like tetrahydrocannabinoid, which is the bit that gets you high. But there's lots of other things in CBD, cannabidiol, that's good for you, and that doesn't contain, or at least contains a tiny amount of THC. But looking at history a bit, what basically brought all of this to the fore was when a young boy, Billy, his name was, there was another one called Alfie, I think, who was suffering terribly, talking about Billy here, suffering terribly from epilepsy and having fits. Couldn't get the cannabidiol type medication in this country, so went to Canada. And you've got to note that Canada just kind of coincidentally has the same queen as us, so they're very similar to us. And a Canadian doctor prescribed cannabidiol, or a cannabis-derived drug, for the the young boy, and it stopped his epilepsy. So when she came back to the UK, she was stopped in customs and this stuff was confiscated. He started fitting, he ended up going to hospital, and then a special case was made, and then that went through the Home Office, and then people started to, because it was a big thing in the newspapers and everybody was up in arms about it. And so they started to say, well, you know, maybe for medical purposes, it ought to be authorized. Now, there were some certain research done by British companies into using cannabis for medical reasons, because you should know that depending on when you take the statistics, Britain is the biggest legal exporter of cannabis or cannabis-derived drugs in the world. And at that time in 2018, it was being exported to other countries in the world, but wasn't allowed to be used here. Which is kind of odd, isn't it? And I'm just going to present these facts and you can draw what conclusions you like. Was this just a matter of maintaining an industry because it couldn't be grown locally unless you had a license, and to get a license, well, you needed to cross certain bridges and perhaps have some kind of influence that would support your license? Well, we'll come into that. But it was something like, you know, you were getting 93 tons of marijuana legally grown and then sent out of the country, and 123 tons of cannabis being confiscated by the police. And that kind of is another statement, isn't it, of how people really want to use cannabis. And if this is a democratic country, shouldn't they be able to do it? Especially if most, and I mean the huge amount, most medical research shows that cannabis doesn't cause mental illness or anything like this. Of course, it is something you could become dependent on, but you could become dependent on chocolate cake, and that would also have health issues against you. So I don't think that's a big argument, but still some people will say it is. But anyway, so the NHS uses a cannabinoid drug called Nabilone, which is provided by the British pharmaceutical industry, and that is used to relieve sickness in people with chemotherapy. So obviously very important for therapeutic treatment of cancer. Trials are under test for other cannabis drugs, for loss of appetite, for HIV and AIDS, also for the eye disease glaucoma, and for epilepsy, especially in children. So you got to say, well, this cannabis stuff, like a lot of the drugs, to be honest, that they're testing now, like mescaline, like DMT, like LSD even, which is a synthetic drug. A lot of these drugs are being tested by countries around Europe for their benefits in helping people with perhaps what you might call mental problems, depression, anxiety, and stuff like that. And you've got to know that the United Nations and I think the World Health Organization do not have cannabis on their dangerous drugs list. Why is it not being used in England, especially as it's now legal for personal use in Canada, right? And a lot of other countries, and in many states around the United States. This is happening more and more. Okay. So it's illegal in the UK with very limited medical use. The UK is home to a company called GW Pharmaceuticals. And GW Pharmaceuticals are the world's largest producers of medical cannabis, and they're behind the first cannabis-derived products. Now, whether you want to read anything into that's got anything to do with the laws, whether they got a competitive advantage, it's up to you. Do your research, check it out. But the weird thing about GW Pharmaceuticals, and this has been in the newspapers, this is not me saying this, I'm doing this from research I've done, and this one actually comes from researchingreform.net, and they say that GW Pharmaceuticals, the largest investor in the UK, is the husband of the ex-Prime Minister Theresa May. So Philip May is one at least of one of the largest investors, and also is and they were approved to provide this drug called Epidiolex, which is a good thing because it's to help people with epilepsy. So that's got to be a good thing. But there was another minister, also in the Conservative government, a Home Office minister, a Victoria Atkins, who recused herself from giving, I don't know what it was, talk or evidence or whatever it was, on drugs, even though she said, oh, drugs are a bad thing, they're terrible and all this kind of thing, because her husband was the owner, or at least a major part of British Sugar, who I think grow or provide the seeds for cannabis for GW Pharmaceuticals. And you've got to know that at the time I did this research, that the CEO of GW Pharmaceuticals was a major Tory party donor. And the Independent said in their newspaper article that this was hypocrisy on a grand scale. Well, you'd kind of wonder about that, wouldn't you? Now, organisations like the Adam Smith Institute said it's ridiculous, Britain's approach towards cannabis. There's a few reasons why. One is it's obviously got medical purposes, for therapeutic purposes. CBD, I should mention, is now available. It's now legal, as long as it's below, I think, 0.3% THC, the bit that gets you high, right? So it is available, so people can participate in its benefits in that sense. But the Adam Smith Institute talked about the fact that if you legalise cannabis, and we're talking about cannabis that gets you high, if it was legalised, it would produce at least £1 billion a year in extra UK tax revenue. It's a win-win, isn't it? Dog. And I think that's important, don't you? I think the other thing it would do is, of course, it would take cannabis off the street. So if you wanted to use some cannabis for recreational purposes, you wouldn't go to some pusher or drug dealer, right? Who also would be able to sell you things like cocaine, heroin, PCP, ecstasy, whatever. No. It would be sold from pharmacies, from clinics, whatever, all licensed, all above, all checked, and it would also be provided in measured doses. Isn't all this good? I think. And I do sort of wonder as well that, I'm going to have to distract my dog in a minute. I also wonder as well if there is some other part of this, that it's convenient that Brexit has kind of flattened everything, that nobody's interested in these things. So this can go under the carpet for the moment. But, of course, in other countries around the world, cannabis is being made legal. Obviously, it's okay for them. They've got medical experts. How come it's okay for their medical experts and not okay for ours? I sort of wonder about that. Whereas most medical people say, no, cannabis is a good thing. So I do sort of wonder. It seems pointless, doesn't it? Now, there was a vote in the House of Commons for a bill to, quote, legalise the possession and consumption of cannabis and to provide for the regulation and production, distribution and sale of cannabis. And this was put by Norman Lamb, who was a Liberal Democrat MP. And the vote was made, and it lost by a vote of 66 to 52. And you've got to ask the question, wait. 66 to 52, so a whole total of 128 people voted on this, but there's over 600 MPs. Where are all of them? Well, the stinking Labour Party refused to vote. They abstained. Something important like this, for the good of the people, taking those drugs off the street and putting them in a legal basis, a control basis. The Labour Party, the party of the people, did not vote for it. They might as well have voted no, because the outcome was obvious what was going to happen. 65 to 52. What's that about? And where are all the other MPs that are supposed to be supporting this? Are they responding to the will of their people who voted them into power? Or are they just saying, I don't want to have anything to do with this, it's too awkward? Or Is there such a push because of the economic benefits of keeping a product illegal so that only certain legal companies can produce it? Is there a benefit? I'll leave that up to you, whatever you want to decide. Now, having done some research and looked around the web and stuff like this, I see a lot of people are saying 5 to 10 years and it'll be legal here too. And I think it's about time too. There are so many benefits. I mean, the hemp market, right, the one that's very low THC and all that lot, is massive. And legalizing cannabis across the board then opens up everything for hemp. Hemp can be used. They can make clothes out of hemp. They can make vehicle fuel out of hemp. Well, who would want to resist that? Well, of course, the big oil industries, of course. There are lots of reasons that hemp is being kept, hemp and cannabis is being kept down. But I think slowly the pressure is coming that eventually it will end up legal. I don't take it. I don't use it. I have no kind of vested interest in it. I just think it's for the good it can do. Number one, for people with issues like epilepsy, like multiple sclerosis, like people undergoing chemotherapy, and for people to take if they want to take it. If alcohol's legal, which is much more harmful than cannabis, if smoking is still legal, which is incredibly more harmful than both of those, how can you then turn around and say you can't have a little joint now and then? As long as you don't drive and all that lot, all the laws apply, but why not? Is there a darker side to this? And I think it's going to come. I really do. I think it's going to be used. And that means it opens it up for research into things like the treatment of anxiety, the treatment of depression, the treatment of PTSD, well, all these different things that suddenly there'll be money there to do that, because now it's not such a struggle to get the stuff in the first place, and it's not such a struggle to get it licensed and use it and so on and so forth. There is a danger that the big companies, the tobacco companies or whoever, might think, oh, here's a good one, we can sell all this stuff. But if it's licensed and run through, just like a chemist, right? They have rules they have to follow. They have to have certifications and licenses. Why not? That's my thought on it. Why not? So don't forget, if you want to look at that podcast, and I did an earlier podcast called Drugs, I think, which is available at www.drandyyates.com, which you can go if you want more details on this, and of course do your own research as well. That's about it, really, I think. So, this is Dr. Andy Yates. This is the Incongruous channel. And please, and if you like this, sorry, I should have said this. If you like this, please like, share, and subscribe. Put my numbers up. More people will look at this. More people will enter into the discussion, if nothing else. I'm not an oracle. I don't provide all that wisdom. Dog's going to have a fight now with the other dog. Because this is the Incongruous channel, right? All right, so you guys, please take care.